Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are wrapping up our review for the lab midterm exam. As a reminder, that exam is available now and it must be submitted by Sunday night at 11:59. So make sure you're planning plenty of time for yourself to review and especially for you to get that exam submitted on time. You should probably tell yourself it's due at 11:30 to make sure that we get it in so you can see your score right away so that Dr. Ollis doesn't have to go in and manually accept your score for you. So to get us ready for the exam, we did some group work to review some of the things that maybe we had forgotten that we covered way back in the beginning of the semester, or some of those things that we definitely just need to practice. So the first thing that we did in our groups to remind us about stuff on the midterm exam was we talked about the various bones of the skull. Some of the bones of the skull, their names are really easy to remember. Some of them, not so much. Let's start with one that I think might have been an easier one to remember. What's the name of the bone that makes up your forehead? My forehead bone up here. Yeah, exactly. Your forehead bone, the one on the front of your skull, is called the frontal bone. Absolutely. Hey, your frontal region, when we're thinking about regional terms, is right there where the frontal bone is. So frontal bone on the very front of the skull. When we talk about the bone with the purple arrow that makes up your nose, what's the name of that bone that we find in the nose? Yeah, exactly. The nasal bone in the nasal region. If somebody breaks their nose, they're breaking the nasal bone. Everything that sticks out below it, so the rest of your nose that's sticking out, all of that is cartilage. Hey, we had a request to talk about tissue locations and functions. Does anyone remember which kind of cartilage we find here in the nose? Which kind of cartilage here? I'll draw it on for us here. I don't remember if that was one of our you should know this location or not. Yeah, I believe is it elastic or is it hyaline? I'm a little sketchy. You're helping me review too. I've got two people voting elastic, so it's probably correct. I don't think we made you know what was in the nose. Is it hyaline? See, I was leaning hyaline. It is hyaline. Okay, that's what I was leaning, and then everyone was voting elastic, and I was like, oh man, y'all were making me second guess it too. Okay, so Kira said that was one that we didn't have to know. So don't freak out too much about knowing that. But the nose is made out of hyaline cartilage. So we didn't have to know that extra stuff for you to know. You break your nose, you break that nasal bone right here in the bridge of the nose. That's most of the really easy ones, or the easier ones. Let's go to the back of the head, because that is a regional term as well. What's the name of the bone in the back of the skull? Yeah, this one back here is the occipital bone. The occipital bone. So the occipital region is the region of your skull in the very back, the base of the skull. Between the frontal bone and the occipital bone, with my blue arrow up there, do we remember what that bone is called there with the blue arrow? The big one, yep, the big one on the sides of your skull is called the parietal bone. So the parietal bone, the big one on the sides, the occipital bone, back of the head, frontal bone, front of the head, obviously. This one labeled here with red, your jawbone. What do we call our jawbone right here? Yeah, exactly. The jawbone is called the mandible. The mandible. Hey, here's a regional term that doesn't directly match up with the bone name. Does anyone remember the name for the chin region on your body? Yeah, the chin region is called the mental region. So mental region is the chin region found on the mandible. Do you all hear my bird in the background? I've got this bush right outside the window, so that bird is like, sweet, it's time for me to get on the sound too. So I apologize. He's having a good old time in my front yard. All right, so your bottom jawbone is the mandible. Up above that is what makes up the upper part of your jaw. This one here is a bone, yeah, a bone called the maxilla, the maxilla. So making up the place where you have your teeth embedded into your skull, the maxilla down below, and the mandible, which is what is your jaw that moves up and down. We have two bones left, and these are the ones that make up your cheekbone. So let's start with the one on the side, because this one's maybe a little bit easier to remember. Yeah, Fanjin got ahead of me. She named our yellow one in the front. So this one over here, which is right over by where your ear would be, is the temporal bone, the temporal bone. Incidentally, when we start talking about the brain in the next half of the lab semester, you would find a temporal lobe right underneath this, and that is the lobe of your brain that helps with hearing. So the temporal bone on top of the temporal lobe. Yeah, and Kira was mentioning one of those bone marking words that we have to learn in groups. This is a marking we learned called the external acoustic meatus, or rather, we didn't learn it yet. We're going to learn it later in the semester. We learned, though, that this thing is a meatus, and a meatus is a kind of hole. So one of our bone marking words that meant a hole was meatus. Another one of our bone marking words that meant a hole was what this one down here was. This one down here was a foramen. So we've got a foramen, we've got a meatus. Yeah, sinus is another empty space, a big hole. So lots of different whole words for us to know from lesson number 6. So temporal bone, when you rub your temples, you're rubbing this one. And then as Fanjin mentioned for us before, this other one that really makes up the front of your cheekbones and kind of extends back is called the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone. So some of our skull bones to review. We do also have to review the rest of the bones of the skeleton too. Remember that you have, I think, 2 visible body assignments due tonight, that at least one of them is reviewing skull bone or bones in general in the body. So visible body assignments due tonight, Friday, and lesson number 6 from lecture due tonight, Friday. All right, now that we've labeled some of those skull bones, let's move on to the next learning activity we did with our groups. Our next learning activity was making us practice our directional terms. Now, before we start filling in the blanks, I want to make a list across the bottom of some of those directional terms in pairs. So let me start with the first pair of directional terms, and that is superior and inferior. When I talk about superior and inferior, what do those words mean? Superior and inferior. What do those words mean? Yeah, exactly. So we could say above or up. I like that. Inferior means below or down. First set of ways we can compare things is if one thing is up higher and the other thing is down lower, or one thing is above and the other thing is below. Superior and inferior. Next set of words that we can do, we could do lateral and medial. Lateral and medial. When we talk about lateral and medial, what do those words mean? Those are a little bit harder to put in easy words, right? Yeah, so it's about that midline, right? Or it's about the middle. So medial, close to middle. Lateral, farther from middle. It's all about the midline of the body. So if you remember way back in week 1, when we first started doing our sessions together, I like to joke, way back in week 1, before you knew if you liked me or not yet, right? we did an example together where we talked about the umbilicus. Does anyone remember what the umbilicus is? The umbilicus? Yeah, exactly. Your belly button. So way back in week 1, we used these terms. Well, technically, we just used the term lateral. I asked you to find some structures that were lateral to the umbilicus, which was anything pretty much, because the umbilicus is in the very middle of your body. So medial in the middle, lateral toward the outside. We could also do, let's do anterior and posterior. What do those ones mean? Anterior and posterior. Yeah, exactly. Anterior, front, or if we want to use our, well, I guess that is our technical word. Sorry. I'll say front or anterior. Wait, that's what we're defining. So anterior toward the front, posterior toward the back. Yeah, that is true. Kira mentioned you do sometimes see there is another set of technical terms for these, dorsal and ventral. Kind of outside of the scope of our class, although we will talk about it when it comes to the spinal cord. So lodge somewhere in the back of your mind, dorsal and ventral means the same thing as back and front, dorsal and ventral. We also need to mention our special ones that pertain to the arms and the legs. Those are proximal and distal. When I talk about proximal and distal, what do those refer to, or what are those related to? Yeah, Kira and Fanchin, they're both mentioning the joints. Yeah, so proximal and distal is all about our attachment joints. So when you think about proximal and distal, you should always think either shoulder or hip. Proximal and distal always have to do with whether we are close or far from the shoulder or close or far from the hip. So if I've got two things that are on the arm, I'm comparing their location to the shoulder. Two things that are on the leg, I compare their location to the hip. And this is because, remember, we could, maybe 20 years ago, I could do a handstand. When I'm doing a handstand, the location of my radius and ulna compared to my humerus, if I'm trying to use my up and downwards, it would change. It wouldn't be the same. But if I'm talking about how close we are to the shoulder, that doesn't change if I'm doing a handstand or if I'm standing in anatomical position. So two things on an arm or two things on a leg, you compare them based on where they attach. So the word proximal means that we're closer to that shoulder or closer to the hip. The word distal means we're farther away. Proximal and distal. There is one other set of directional terms that we haven't listed on here, and these terms are deep and superficial. Deep and superficial. And these terms are related to how close we are to the surface of the body, essentially. So if you're close to the surface of the body, you're superficial. So close to, I'll say close to outside the body. If you are in the core of the body, in the very center of the body, we would say that you're deep. So this deep and superficial term, these are used when things wrap around each other. When things are completely wrapped around each other, then I'm going to use the comparison words deep and superficial. Now that we've defined all of our directional terms, let's go through these statements, and I've got another set of statements for us to make sure we can use them. First thing I always want you to make sure you're doing when you look at a statement like this, please check the order of the structures that we're talking about. So what I mean by that is my statement right here, that the liver is blank to the small intestine. Remember that whatever directional term goes in this blank, we're always describing the liver, its location compared to this one. Because what we'll do to practice is I could write this statement the other way too. I could flip out the order that these organs are in, and then I would put in a completely different directional term. So check the order of your structures. That's going to help you know which directional term you should be applying. So my first statement here, we're talking about the liver and we're talking about the small intestine. Hey, here's a review for us. The liver and the small intestine. First question, which organ system are these part of? The liver and the small intestine. Which organ system are we part of? Yeah, these are both part of the digestive system. Remember, Dr. Ollis's favorite system. So we got to start off with comparing stuff in my favorite system. So the liver and the small intestine, they're both part of the digestive system. They are both found in which cavities in the body? Now I'm making you use those body cavity words. We're just going to hit all the things. Yeah, so I chatted some with, can't remember, I think Audrey, we were talking about this, and a few other people yesterday we were talking about this. Whenever we ask about body cavities, you always start with either the thoracic cavity, which is the chest, or the abdominopelvic cavity, which is everything under the diaphragm. Every organ that we ask you to say its location in the body, we're always going to start with one of those two big ones. Is it in the thoracic cavity or is it in the abdominopelvic cavity? Well, in the case of all the digestive system organs, they're definitely found in the abdominopelvic cavity. So both of these things in the abdominopelvic cavity. More specifically then, for every organ, we always have to be specific too. When we talk about the digestive system organs, those are found in the abdominal cavity, that specific part of the big abdominopelvic cavity. When you're thinking about what we find in the pelvic cavity, really the only organ we studied in the pelvic cavity is the bladder. You do also find things like the uterus or the ovaries in there, but we didn't talk about those this semester. So liver and small intestine. If I were to ask you on the midterm exam, name the two body cavities they're found in, first you would tell me abdominopelvic. That's the big one. Next, you would tell me they're in the abdominal cavity, the two cavities that they're found in. Hey, while we're on the cavities train here, our next statement asks about the heart and the lungs. When we talk about the heart and the lungs, they're in the same big cavity. What's the cavity that has both the heart and the lungs? Yeah, exactly. The thoracic cavity has the heart and the lungs. When we talk more specifically about the lungs, what's the name of the specific cavity that the lungs are found in? Yeah, the lungs are found in the pleural cavity, absolutely, the pleural cavity. And the heart is found in the other one that's in the thoracic region called the pericardial cavity. So again, it's either always thoracic or abdominal pelvic, and then it's going to be something more specific inside of there. Body cavities, something to expect on our exam. I took you down a huge bunny hole. I apologize. I do that sometimes. Let's go back to what we were actually talking about. And we were actually talking about directional terms. So let's look at our statement again. We're talking about the liver compared to the small intestine. When we were in our groups, what did we say? The liver is what to the small intestine? Yeah, the liver is superior. Absolutely. The liver is above the small intestine. Remember, too, that when we were working on these statements, I told you find the simplest possible way to compare these organs or these bones to each other. What's the most obvious way? Like if I had my 4-year-old look at the picture, what is she going to say? Well, she's going to say that the liver is above the small intestine. Based on that fact, we're going to say that the liver is superior to the small intestine. This is where I mentioned I want to make sure that you check the order of your organs, because check it out. If your statement instead said that the small intestine is blank to the liver, what word would we put in the new blank if we started with the small intestine and compared that to the liver? Yeah, now we're going to use the opposite word. Absolutely. The small intestine is inferior to the liver. So this is why we've got to read our sentences slowly. And I'd recommend too putting in your normal word or your definition word into the sentence first. So when we make a comparison, the liver is above the small intestine. If I know what word goes in here, then I can connect that to my anatomy directional term. So the liver is superior to the small intestine, or the small intestine is inferior to the liver. All right, let's talk about our next set of statements here. Our next one, the heart is blank to the lungs. What did we say? The heart is, yeah, exactly. The heart is medial to the lungs. I do get this question a lot. Technically, the lungs don't wrap all the way around the heart. So we wouldn't technically say that the heart is deep to the lungs, because there are some places where it's not all the way around it. That being said, it probably would be partial credit. Best answer though is the heart is in between. It's in the middle of those two lungs on either side. When we go down here to the trachea and the esophagus, before we fill in our blank, where in the body do we find the trachea and the esophagus? What part of the body are those found in? The trachea and the esophagus. Yeah, these are those tubes when you're looking at our model and you're looking inside the neck region or inside the throat region. These are the two tubes that we see there. One of those tubes is in front of the other tube. Who's in front? Yeah, the trachea is in front of the esophagus. That's actually our statement here too, right? So the trachea is in front of the esophagus. Yeah, Tiana is mentioning the best way to remember that is if you can't breathe and you go to the ER, they can do what's called a tracheotomy, where they cut open the front of your throat and stick a tube in to help you breathe. If the esophagus was in front, they wouldn't be able to get to your trachea. They wouldn't be able to get to your airway like that. So the trachea is in front, or it is anterior to the esophagus. Anterior to the esophagus. All right, let's move down to our next one. Our next one talks about the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder, is an example of an organ found in which specific cavity? What's the specific name for the urinary bladder? Yeah, this is our one organ that we talked about that we find in the pelvic cavity. So it's found in the pelvic cavity, which is the lowest cavity in the body, in the torso. So when we're talking about something like the lungs that I find in the thoracic cavity, or more specifically in the pleural cavity, what directional term would we use to describe its location? Essentially the pelvic cavity compared to the pleural cavity. Yeah, we would definitely use that term inferior. Correct, inferior. So the urinary bladder is inferior to the lungs. My last statement here, we're comparing the humerus to the ulna. Now, anytime you read a bone question, the first thing I want you to think about is, are these two things that are on the same limb? So are these two arm bones or two leg bones? In this case, is the answer to that yes or no? Is this two arm bones or two leg bones that we're comparing here? Yes, it is this time. We're talking about the humerus, which is what we find in your upper arm, and the ulna that we find in your forearm. Because we're comparing two things that are in the arm, these are our only options. My only options are proximal and distal because they're both in the arm. When I talk about the humerus, is that closer or farther from the shoulder compared to the ulna? Is the humerus closer or farther from the shoulder? Yeah, it's absolutely closer. It actually makes up the shoulder joint, right? The humerus is up there in your shoulder. So if I'm talking about what's closer to the joint, the anatomy directional term I'm going to use is proximal. Proximal. Yeah, Audrey brought up a good one for us to review. Maybe instead of saying the humerus, maybe I ask you about the radius. Maybe I ask you about the radius, comparing the radius to the ulna. When we talk about the radius and the ulna, both of them are the same distance away from the shoulder because they're next door neighbors. They're right by each other. So I can't use the comparison of how close or far they are from the shoulder. Instead, I need to compare them to the middle of the body. So who's closer to the middle and who's farther from the middle? To answer this question, whether we're talking about the arms or the legs, remember that you have to think back to anatomical position. So imagine for yourself when you're in anatomical position, your palms of your arms are facing forward. So I can't see you. You should do this right now while you're sitting at your desk or your table or on your bed. Put your arm down with your palm facing forward. Notice how your thumb sticks away from the midline of your body. In anatomical position, the thumb is always toward the outside of the body. The pinky is always toward the inside or toward the middle of the body. So if I'm comparing the radius and the ulna, or if I'm comparing the tibia and the fibula, the directional terms I'm going to use are lateral and medial. So if my statement is the radius is blank to the ulna, is the radius lateral or medial to the ulna? Is the radius closer to the middle or farther? Yeah, the radius is going to be lateral to the ulna. Because remember, the radius is on the thumb side, the ulna is on the pinky side. I like to remember up, UP, the ulna and the pinky. Then we've got the radius and the thumb together on the other side. So if I change this statement instead of the humerus, now I'm comparing the ulna to the radius. The radius is lateral to the ulna. Or if we did it backwards, the ulna would be medial to the radius. So make sure we check the order that our things are in. Let's do another set of terms. My next statement says the patella is blank to the ribs. Hey, where's the patella, by the way? Where do we find the patella? Exactly. Yep, the patella is the kneecap. My daughter knows that one. My 4-year-old knows the patella. The patellar region is right there in the knee. That's where the kneecap is. So the patella is a bone on the leg. The ribs are not a bone on the leg, right? I hope we know at this point, as we're preparing for the midterm, that the ribs are not found in the leg. If you know that, you're in good shape. That's helpful. So I can't compare them with proximal distal. I need to make the most obvious comparison when I compare your kneecap to your rib cage. What's the most obvious comparison? Yeah, exactly. The most obvious comparison is that the patella is going to be inferior, or it's going to be below the ribs. Patella is down lower, the ribs are up higher. The patella is inferior to the ribs. Next, we're talking about the vertebrae and the sternum. Where do I find the vertebrae, by the way? What part of your body are the vertebrae found in? Yeah, exactly. All the bones that make up your spine, they're all called vertebrae. We have different kinds of vertebrae. So the ones that are up the highest are called cervical vertebrae in the cervical region. Then we have the ones in the chest region called the thoracic vertebrae. And then down lowest, we have those things called the lumbar vertebrae. All of those are vertebrae. All of those are bones that make up your spine. We're comparing those to the sternum. Where is the sternum found on you? How might we describe where the sternum is? Yeah, the sternum is on the very front of your chest in the very middle. It's in that sternal region. That's how it's got its name. So your breastbone in the center of the chest, that is on the front of your body. The vertebrae are on the back of your body. So which directional term am I going to put in here to compare the vertebrae to the sternum? The vertebrae are blank to the sternum. Yeah, they're found behind the sternum. That means they're posterior. They're behind. Hey, look, I've got phalanges in the foot, which are the toe bones in the foot, and I'm comparing them to the femur. I've got two structures on a leg, which means my options are proximal and distal. Which word goes in the blank when we compare the toes to the femur, to the thigh bone? Yeah, exactly. The toes are distal to the femur. Hey, check this out. I could say the phalanges of the hand, compared to the femur. What would be the most obvious comparison now if I changed that statement? Yeah, now my most obvious comparison is that the hand is above the femur, so the phalanges of the hand would be superior to the femur. So if I switch it out to where they're not both on the same leg anymore, and I'm talking about something that's on the arm and something that's on the leg, Kaylin's totally right. I can't use proximal and distal anymore. I can only use that when they're on the same one. So two things on an arm, two things on a leg, my only options, proximal and distal. Something on an arm, something on a leg, well, then I start to use some of those more normal words, if you will, superior and inferior. Hey, these last two are maybe the trickiest of the bunch. These last two are talking about structures that wrap around each other, things that surround each other. So the rib cage completely wraps around the heart. So the heart is found in the very middle of those ribs. What was my anatomy word for something that's in the very middle, in the very inside? Yeah, exactly. We would say that the heart is deep to the ribs. The heart is completely surrounded by ribs. That's going to keep the heart safe. That's a good thing. When I talk about the skin compared to the ribs, the skin completely wraps around the ribs. So what word would I put in this blank? The skin is, yeah, exactly. It's the opposite of deep. It's superficial. The skin is superficial to the ribs. Hey, something I chatted about with some friends yesterday. Anytime we talk about the skin is the most superficial structure in the body. So your skin is on the very outside of you. When we're talking about what's closest to the outside, the skin is it. That is it. So the skin is always going to be superficial to things or other things. Anything that we compare to the skin is always going to be deep. So wink, wink, nudge, nudge. When we're thinking about the skin that surrounds your entire body, superficial and deep. That's the words we use for that. We just pounded through those directional terms. Before I move on, what questions do we have? Or shoot me an emoji. How are we feeling about directional terms? Here's how I'm feeling. Cha-cha. I had to. I found the arrow emojis. It was just too good. Audrey asked about the planes. Planes are slightly different than directional terms. Planes do kind of relate to directional terms because when we talk about the way that planes cut the body, they cut it into pieces that we could describe with these terms. So here, let's do what I did yesterday with my friends. We're going to draw a little stick figure person. Look at, hey, my person looks better today. Yesterday, his arms were down way too low. Okay, so here's my stick figure person. We're going to do some planes really fast. The first kind of plane I'm going to draw is going to divide his head into lateral and medial parts. Lateral, not quite lateral, medial. That's weird. Let's try again. Ignore Dr. Hollis. We're gonna do superior and inferior first because that's easiest. Here we go. I have used an X-ray and I am looking at his head. This piece that I see up here is my superior part of him. The piece that I see down here is the inferior part of him. What is the name of the kind of plane that cuts the body into superior and inferior parts? Yeah, absolutely. This is called a transverse plane, a transverse plane. So when you talk about planes, the way that I can cut body parts, essentially, if I make a transverse cut or I do a transverse image, that's going to section things into a superior part and an inferior part. If I am sectioning things, I didn't draw him from the side, so I can't really do anterior and posterior. Here, let's check this out. Here we go. We are going to make it work. I'm going to draw a new little friend here, and he's got his hyaline cartilage nose. Oh, this poor friend. He's sad. Okay, here's my plane that cuts him into an anterior part and a posterior part. Yeah, Kira's asking if it's not a penguin in disguise. Honestly, I should have just said it was a penguin. Like, let's just declare that this is a penguin because that's really what it looks like. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, so my chat is telling me what we're looking at here, if we make an anterior part and a posterior part, is what's called a coronal plane. A coronal plane, anterior versus posterior. We can also make a cut that divides the body into left and right. So we would say over here, we've got our, hey, here's a good review. This side, let me point. This side over here Let's assume our stick figure friend is looking at us. Is this left or right? If this is my person, he's standing looking at you. Is this left or right? Yeah, this is left. Good reminder for us. Remember that in anatomy, you got to put yourself in your patient's shoes. So I can make a plane that divides the body into left and right parts. If those parts are not equal, like I'm seeing here, how there's a really small part and a really big part, I would name this plane, yeah, like Fanchon mentioned, parasagittal. Parasagittal. Let me move that over. Parasagittal means I've made left and right parts, but they're not equal. Parasagittal. What if my left and right parts were equal? What's their name if they are equal? So here comes that equal cut there. Yeah, if they are equal, we call that mid-sagittal. Mid-sagittal, absolutely. Mid-sagittal plane makes equal left and right. Unequal left and right is parasagittal. Transverse plane makes us superior and inferior. A coronal plane makes us anterior and posterior. We are missing one kind of plane. That one kind of plane looks like this, where we go at an angle. Yep, and like Fanchon mentioned, this is a plane called an oblique plane. Oblique plane. Hey, now we kind of got the dancing thing going on, right? Looks like he's got two sets of arms and they're dancing. It's perfect. We can even add a little bit of music. Here's some music for our friend and his little penguin. Does that help with the planes? We thumbs up on the planes, the ways that we can section the body. And you have some good pictures in the guided lesson as well that don't look quite as creepy, especially as this one right here. This one's pretty creepy. Penguin person. So coronal plane, anterior and posterior. Yeah, Birdman, right? All right, the one last thing that I had us do in groups was work on mitosis, because that's something that we said we wanted to chat about. So we're going to spend some time together looking at this slide, and then I'm going to pull up some more slides that have pictures of mitosis for us to work on. We'll chat a little bit about the models. So definitely want to make sure we get mitosis. First thing we mentioned before we went into groups, remember anytime that it says phases of mitosis, mitosis only has 4 parts. There's only 4 options for mitosis. Can you remind me in the chat? What are my options when I talk about phases of mitosis? Okay, Fanchon mentioned anaphase. Awesome. Spelled that wrong. Oh well. Metaphase. Yeah. Telophase. And Rima mentioned my last one. Prophase. Telophase and prophase. We did them in all kinds of different orders. Here's my reminder for you. The way I remember the order they go in, PMAT. So prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. PMAT. That's the order we go in when we're doing mitosis. Like we talked about before we started on this activity, remember that the other way that I can ask you about what's going on in the models or in the pictures is I can ask you which part of the cell cycle, if I use that tip off for you, part of the cell cycle. If I'm talking about parts of the cell cycle, there's 2 different options. One of the options is called interphase, and that's when the cell is doing its normal life stuff, so generic cell stuff. The other option, like we've said in the chat, is cytokinesis. Cytokinesis. Can you remind me, when we talk about cytokinesis, what's going on in that process? Or what does cytokinesis mean? Cytokinesis. Yeah, exactly. We are dividing up the cytoplasm, which this is more of a lecture note than a lab note, but I'll remind you, when I use that word cytoplasm, that means the cytosol and the organelles. The cytosol and the organelles. Yeah, Kaylin's totally right. Cytokinesis is going to happen at the same time as telophase. So that's usually the way that we can tell that a cell is in telophase, if we're starting to see evidence of cytokinesis. Because Audrey's correct. The thing that you notice during cytokinesis is that thing called the cleavage furrow, where the plasma membrane of the dividing cells actually starts to fold inside on itself. So we start to pinch these cells apart from each other. So cytokinesis is when we are dividing up the cytoplasm, when we're splitting up all the stuff in the cell. Telophase is part of mitosis. Remember that the goal of mitosis is when we divided up the genetic information. So mitosis, we're dividing DNA. The soup and the organelles, we divide those using cytokinesis. Looking at this picture here, I do actually have a cell that if I was to ask you to identify it, I would have to use this part of the cell cycle thing. Want to draw your attention to this one down here. It is kind of cut off, but this one down here is a really good example of interphase. Can you explain to me in the chat if you have any ideas? How do I know that this is an interphase cell? Any ideas? I'm going to label it for us just as a heads up for us. Interphase. Yeah, exactly. Several of us are mentioning that when you look at this cell, you see chromatin. Chromatin. That's the loose spaghetti noodle form of the DNA in a cell. When a cell is not dividing, when it's not doing mitosis, all of its genetic information is loose and floating around inside the nucleus. So you see a nucleus that's pretty solid colored, that there's not really dark individual lines inside of. That's what we call chromatin, the loose form of DNA. So this particular cell down here, if I had this one labeled, I would ask you, which part of the cell cycle is this cell in? And you would tell me that this cell is an interphase. So interphase cell down here, it's not doing mitosis. That's why its genetic information is all fuzzy and dark. When I condense my genetic information, it starts to look a little bit more like this. So this is a cell that I can ask you for a phase of mitosis. Which phase of mitosis do we see in this cell right here? Yeah, this cell over here is a cell that is in prophase. Prophase. That is the first phase of mitosis. This is the first step when a cell is getting ready to divide. What are some of the things that you remember that happen during prophase? What happens during prophase? Yep, so my chromatin condenses. We turn it into those things that we call chromosomes. Absolutely. Yeah, and the other major thing besides making those chromosomes that I need to be able to divide, the other thing that happens is my nuclear membrane dissolves. Nuclear membrane dissolves, or it falls apart. So essentially, at the end of prophase, I don't have a nucleus left, and I have these chromosomes, these condensed forms of genetic information that I'm going to divide up. So this is a cell, we're not going to ask you early prophase versus late prophase, but this would be a cell that we would say is in late prophase because there's no nuclear envelope anymore. That membrane is gone and this genetic information is all condensed. This is a great example of a cell in prophase. From prophase, we transition into my next phase that I see over here. What's this phase over here? This is the one I think is the easiest to identify. Yeah, exactly. This one that we see up here is metaphase. Metaphase. And the way you're going to identify metaphase is this thing we see right here, this line of chromosomes. Remember that we call this the metaphase plate. The metaphase plate, when there's a line of chromosomes. Yeah, absolutely. Like Tien said, those chromosomes are meeting in the middle. Metaphase, the chromosomes meet in the middle of the cell. So when we meet up in the middle, that's metaphase. And remember that the reason we get to the middle like this is because I've got those centrioles, the churro organelles, or the licorice organelles. They're putting out their little spindle proteins that attach to all of these chromosomes, and then we play tug of war. And we tug and we tug and we tug back and forth until everybody ends up lined up in the middle. Metaphase, when everybody's lined up or we all meet in the middle because those centrioles are pulling on us. If we pull enough, what ends up happening is these chromosomes that were in the middle in a line, they actually end up breaking. So this phase I'm looking at right here with my broken chromosomes, what phase of mitosis do we see right here? Yeah, now we're up to anaphase. Anaphase. So when we talk about anaphase, my chromosomes split. The big thing with anaphase is that the chromosomes split. So they're going in two different directions to two different places in the cell. In anaphase, those chromosomes are still moving. So you can see here how their lines kind of point. You can only really see them over here, but their lines are pointing toward the middle of the cell. They're still actively being pulled away from their neighbor. The other way I know this isn't telophase is because I don't see that cleavage furrow that we talked about. So I don't see a space in the middle of the membrane where it started to fold down on itself, where it would be making two different cells. So this cell is still in anaphase. We're still pulling those chromosomes apart. I know at least one of my groups talked about this one down here. Let's chat about it together. Now as a big group. What do we see going on down here? Did we identify this one down here too? Yeah, this is another one down here that's got metaphase going on. Another metaphase cell. You can see that metaphase plate again. Absolutely. I'm going to pull up some more slides for mitosis. Before I do that, are there any questions about this slide? Any more questions about this one? Or are we thumbs up on here? Okay, seeing a lot of thumbs up, so that's perfect. Let me see. Okay, so I am going to, ooh, I got a dolphin from Temiteo. Look at me, man. I'm making the dolphin. All right, let me show you the PowerPoint. I mentioned this to you when we were looking at tissues. Give my computer a chance to catch up. Okay. This is what we're going to look at now together, is in the student Google Drive for you. Oops, let's see. There we go. It is the thing called, there's a folder in the student Google Drive called Tissue Images from Our Slide. I know, Kaylin's like, I hate these, but it's really good practice for you. I know, it sucks, but it's good practice. So these are images taken from our slides to help us identify our different phases of mitosis. So let's work together. You can practice with these images again after class because it's a PowerPoint that you have access to. So let's go through and chat. I want to start with this over here. What do we see going on over here? If I asked you, let's start with for the phase of mitosis, If I'm talking about the phase of mitosis, yeah, this would be telophase. Remember, when we're describing what happens in telophase, what happens in telophase is I have two new nuclei, so two new places for genetic information. We see the DNA is decondensing, or it's loosening up to make chromatin again. That's how you know we're in telophase. Yeah, and Tien mentioned the way that we can, another way we can tell we're in telophase is you can very clearly see that cleavage furrow. So we can see the indentations, and even notice how this membrane has completely, pretty much almost separated these two cells from each other. This cell is almost completely done dividing. Like if it's not completely done, it's almost completely done. So the cleavage furrow is that indentation that we see there. So if I asked you which phase of mitosis we see here, the answer, like you told me, would be telophase. If I asked you which part of the cell cycle we see right here, what would we say for which part of the cell cycle? Yeah, exactly. The part of the cell cycle that we see is cytokinesis, dividing up the cytoplasm from the two cells. Yeah, Audrey mentioned that she sees it as two separate cells. I totally get that. They look, they may actually be two separate cells. If we had it on the exam though, we would include an arrow that pointed to both of them, or you've seen it on the homework where it's just a box around things and we ask you what phase of mitosis we're seeing. So if I give you something that looks like this, assume that I'm not asking you to tell me that this is a cell in interphase. Assume that we're asking you for a cell that's in telophase. I suppose the other way you can kind of tell that it's still kind of in telophase is I can kind of see those chromosomes a little bit still too. It's not completely fuzzy. There is still some chromosomes that need to loosen up. So this would be a good example of telophase. What do we have going on over here? Who do we see over here? Yep, so several of us are chiming in. We are looking at an example of anaphase over here. See how those chromosomes are both being pulled away, so they're trailing toward the middle of the cell. Yeah, Laura was mentioning about metaphase. If we were in metaphase, we would see all of them still stuck together. But the fact that they've been split means that we've transitioned into anaphase. Audrey mentioned that her Bio 1408 teacher said the home wrecker phase. I like that. Yep, we're pulling apart those chromosomes that we're so happy together. So when you see these two distinct groups, we have moved into anaphase. Let's see what else we got. I haven't, ooh, uh-oh. Oh, that was the last one. That figures. Okay. Let's go up. So you have all these pictures, by the way, that you're seeing on my screen. Let me make it big. This one is another beautiful example of anaphase. The reason this one is anaphase and not telophase is because I don't see that cleavage furrow that we were talking about before. So if there's no cleavage furrow going on, and you can see those individual chromosomes in here, this is an example of anaphase. I've got several cells around it that are either in early prophase, because I can see some of those spaghetti noodle parts inside of them. I don't see a really awesome example of interphase, but lots of early prophase cells here. Man, your teacher is nerding out here. Look at that. Look at how pretty that is. What phase am I admiring here? Yep, another anaphase up here where they're split. And look how clearly we can see them lined up here. This cell, I can see that metaphase plate really well. So really good metaphase right here with all those cells in a line, or those chromosomes in a line, as opposed to split up like we can see right here. I've got a decent example of interphase up here, because notice how we don't see lines inside this nucleus. We just kind of see a hazy spot. So this would be an example of a cell in interphase. This might be another interphase cell over here as well, where it's kind of dark but not really defined. Notice how I've got this neighbor over here, where if you look inside, you can see some dark lines. Those are the chromosomes that have condensed. So this is an example of a prophase cell. Compare that to over here, where we've got an interphase cell, where nothing's really happening yet. Hey, this one right here, I don't have a cleavage furrow. I've got distinct chromosomes. What phase of mitosis do we see here? Yeah, your teacher's on repeat, right? I just keep finding those anaphase cells. Yeah, so anaphase is when they are separated from each other, but we don't have a cleavage furrow, and we're not seeing those chromosomes decondensing yet. Yeah, so Kira asked a good question. She asked if we will specify whether we want cell cycle or mitosis on every one of these questions, and that is correct. Yes, we will. So check your wording, because right away we're going to give you hints for what we're looking for. So watch that. Do I ask you for a phase of mitosis, or do I ask you for a part of the cell cycle? This particular slide, Tian asked about metaphase. I don't see a good metaphase on here. Let me see if I can find another good metaphase for us. Let's see. Oh goodness, I just have to look at this, man. Look at how beautiful. Got a telophase going on right here. You can see the cleavage furrow, and you can also see how we're starting to form two new nuclei here. We can only kind of see it. I would suspect that if they cut the cells a little bit differently, this might be a metaphase cell, but I will find you a better one than that. Timoteo, on the midterm, there is no typing, so it will it'll just be those drop-down menus like you're used to. Another gorgeous anaphase. Look at that. So got an anaphase right here. Well, Tien, that was a bad example of metaphase. Let me try to find you a good metaphase. Ooh, look at these prophases, guys. See these little chromosomes in here? I'm loving it. Yeah, this one would be considered anaphase because that cleavage furrow. Absolutely. Cleavage furrow. There we go. Check this out. So Tien was asking, oh, did I say anaphase? I apologize if I said anaphase. If you see a cleavage furrow, it is 95% of the time it's going to be telophase. The only exception to that would be, so here we'll go back. We're seeing that cleavage furrow, and see how this one is getting all fuzzy. We're starting to form a new nucleus over here, and these chromosomes are all together in one place. So I've got a cleavage furrow. I've got two completely distinct sets of genetic information, and one of them I can definitely see is starting to get fuzzy. This is an example of telophase. I talked fast, I apologize. This one is telophase. We also looked at, this is another telophase because of those two distinct nuclei with the cleavage furrow, telophase. Here's the metaphase that we were on. So Tien, when you look at this one, do you see that line of chromosomes right here in the middle of the cell? These two things, by the way, these are the centrioles that make the proteins that are playing tug of war with these chromosomes. So I've got a line of chromosomes in the middle with those centrioles pulling on them to divide them. I would suspect that these two cells just finished dividing. You can see how dark their nucleus is. When your chromosomes are not condensed, when they're all loose and spaghetti noodle-like, this is what the nucleus looks like. It's a dark spot where those chromosomes are decondensed into that chromatin form. Here would be another one that we would say is metaphase. Again, with this one, you can see those two areas where the centrioles would be. I'm actually now going to start paying attention every time I look for a metaphase. Yeah, it's going to be a very prominent line. Absolutely. TNS, if it's a prominent line, yes. You will see two prominent lines when we're doing anaphase. So if there's more than one line of chromosomes, that's going to be anaphase. If there's one line of cells or chromosomes, I'm done. If there's one line of chromosomes, metaphase. If there's two lines of chromosomes, anaphase. This one up here, we wouldn't include it on an exam, to be fair, but this one up here is actually a really good example of late prophase. You see all the little tiny squiggles that are those chromosomes here, and they're just floating around right here. That nucleus just dissolved. So this cell is basically just finished with prophase. So all of its little chromosomes are floating around right here. So I'm not going to put this one on the midterm exam, but for your reference, here's what a really late prophase looks like. All those little chromosomes fell out. We condensed them, they fell out, they look like this. Okay, so here's another anaphase. See, I've got two groups of genetic information. See these little stringies that are going between them? Those are the proteins that are pulling apart. So if you still see this connection between them as they're being pulled apart, that's a tip-off for anaphase. Also tip-off for anaphase the fact that there's no cleavage furrow. So there's no cleavage furrow here, and I can see how these two things are still kind of tug-of-warring with each other. Both of those mean that this one is anaphase. We're going to look for that cleavage furrow to help us find telophase. Not a great one, but this would be another anaphase. I've got two groups of genetic information on kind of separated from each other, different parts of this cell. So this is probably very early anaphase because they're still really close together. And another cell down here that those chromosomes just left the nucleus. This would be another one that we would say is a cell in prophase. Prophase. I guess this wasn't the slide that we used today, but check this out. What phase do we have going on right here? Yeah, this is a really good one. That would be anaphase. You notice how we can see those stringies connecting it, but we can also see those two sets of chromosomes that are being pulled apart. So this, again, you find this in the student Google Drive. There's a folder inside of there that says tissue images from our slides. This particular slideshow is called Mitosis. So download this and use that to help you practice identifying the phases. Not every cell on these slides, we didn't talk about every cell on these slides. I wouldn't ask you about every one of the cells, but see which ones you can find a phase in. And maybe what even is more helpful is to consider using that review assignment, the midterm review assignment part 1, because you can go through and just answer the questions that have blastodisc slide pictures. So just pick these ones, grade it, and see how you did on it. I mentioned this, I can't remember if it was in the histology session or if it was yesterday. Once you get the score that you want on the midterm review assignment, go through and do it a bunch more times, just focusing on the questions you care about. You don't have to redo everything. Once you've gotten your 80 or your 90 or your 100, whatever you're shooting for, then just go in and take it 20 more times, focusing on the questions that gave you trouble. That's the way for you to get the feedback that you want. And I don't care if your last attempt, your score is a 20%. I'm only going to look at your highest score. So use it as many times as you can to get yourself some feedback. Yeah, so Audrey's asking about basically the word questions related to mitosis and cell cycle. So let me see if I have. So I'll pull up, you've got these pictures in the guided lesson. I'll pull them up just to give us something to reference to when we're talking about things. When you're filling in the statements, when you're trying to match up the phases of mitosis or the parts of the cell cycle, let's talk about some of the things that we would say for each of these things. Some of the things that I would say when we're talking about interphase, I would say that the cell's DNA is in the form of chromatin, or the cell is growing and building new proteins. I would say that the cell has a nucleus. Those are some of the things that are happening when a cell is in interphase. And if I'm asking you about interphase, remember, I'm going to ask you about the part of the cell cycle. I'm not going to ask about mitosis. I'm going to ask about the part of the cell cycle. When I start asking you about the phase of mitosis, where chromosomes form, so where I condense my DNA, or the phase of mitosis, where the nuclear envelope dissolves, both of those are things that happen in prophase. When I ask you about the phase of mitosis, where the chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell, that's metaphase. When I ask you about the phase of mitosis where we see the metaphase plate, that's obviously metaphase as well. When we ask about the phase of mitosis where the chromosomes split, or where the chromosomes are sent to opposite ends of the dividing cell, those are descriptions of anaphase. When I ask you for the phase of mitosis where two new nuclei form, or when the chromosomes loosen back up and turn into chromatin, those are descriptions of telophase. If I ask you for the part of the cell cycle where the cleavage furrow is seen, or where we're dividing up the cytoplasm and the organelles, those are descriptions of cytokinesis. Does that help with your question, Audrey? Perfect. Good. So I have about 10 minutes left. I am sharing my computer with my husband today. He's got a meeting at 3, so we have to be totally done. I got about 10 more minutes to talk about stuff. Do we have particular requests for what we spend that last little bit talking about? Yeah, Audrey, to your question about chromatin, that would be correct. We see that during interphase. Yeah, that'd be the only time. Well, so we would also see chromatin if it says that DNA loosens up and becomes chromatin again, that could be telophase. But yeah, if it's asking about the part of the cell cycle, correct, that would be interphase, would be when we see that. Yeah, I'm with Kira to your statement, Kaylin, about everything. Almost. 15 minutes, we could have covered everything from beginning to end. Alas, not quite. Well, here, why don't I use my last little bit here, try to find my mouse. Share blank whiteboard here. Yeah, so Audrey is asking for anyone interested, if you all want to powwow, you are totally welcome to come into our virtual classroom. I will not be here on Sunday, but you are welcome to come in here if you all want to chat with each other, to ask questions. Definitely, yeah, so if you want to do that, please, that would be a great way for you to review and quiz each other. Absolutely. What I'll use our time here at the end to do then is I want to go over just some basics of the exam, just so we are mentally prepared and know as much as we can about the exam. So the lab midterm exam, let's talk about it. It's open now, so anytime between now and closes Sunday at 11:59 p.m. You have 75 minutes to complete the exam. The exam is worth 90 points. So that means there's going to be 90 drop-down menus or 90 multiple choice question type things for you to answer. It's the same format as homework, The best way to review is using those midterm review assignments. Those assignments are due by Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. Don't do those assignments after you take the exam because they're not going to help you. I'm sure most of you have at least looked at them. Please make sure to do those review assignments before you try to take the exam, because that's going to be a good way for you to check yourself. Kaylin, for your exam, it's only lessons number 1 through 6. For everyone else, lessons number 1 through 6. But for Kaylin, it's only 1 through 6. So the content is lab lessons number 1 through number 6. We talked about this a little bit, I think when I was in office hours yesterday with some people. About 33% of the exam is tissues, which is maybe jaw-dropping. It's identifying tissues, it's knowing where they're found, it's knowing what they do. That is a third of the exam. So if you have not kicked yourself into gear with those tissues, gotta do it. Lessons 1 through 3. That's going to be another 33% of the exam. So mitosis, regional terms, bones, all that kind of stuff, that's another third of the exam. And then the last third of the exam is lessons 5 and 6, the stuff that we covered here at the end. That might not be quite, it might be maybe a little bit more than 30% because there wasn't as much content here. But definitely make sure we know our tissues. That is something that is absolutely worthwhile in your studying. Yeah, so Fanchin is asking about visible body. There is not anything in visible body for the exam. We put a folder in there just so that if you're just looking at visible body and you're confused about what's going on this week, you know that it's exam week. So the exam is only in Blackboard. So you'll log into Blackboard. You should be able to see it now. So when you're in the lab resources area and you go to the week 7 folder for this week, you should see that lab exam. It should be visible to you. Before you try to take that exam, remember how I told you to click on the secure exam proctor before you take the exam. Yeah, that's going to log you into Proctorio. This logs into Proctorio because we are using Proctorio for this exam. We are using Proctorio. A couple of quick notes with Proctorio. Make sure when you start the exam that you can see your face in your little webcam view. It shows you what it's recording. I do need to be able to see your face the whole time. I promise I'm not going to watch you the whole time, but I do need to be able to see your face in there. The computer will tell me if I can't. So make sure face is visible. I'm not going to go through and watch you, I promise. Yeah, so Tian asked about a piece of paper, just like we did with the first exam. If you would like to use a piece of scratch paper, I'm okay with that. As soon as your exam pops up, so you can see those questions, please hold up your paper for me. Show me the front side and the back side. Then you can use it during the test. Right before you click submit, please hold up that paper for me and rip it up on the camera so that I can see that you've destroyed it, essentially. So if you would like to use that scratch paper, that's fine with me. But again, show me front side and back side, and then show it to me ripping it up. Are there any other questions about the exam? Yeah, go for it, Kira. Yeah, so if you don't write anything on the paper, that's fine. Yeah, just show me that the front and back is blank still. You'd be very attached to that paper, right? It's your special paper. It's my I survived the midterm paper, right? That's okay, Audrey. It was a learning curve for the first time, so you're okay for the first time. So again, if you use one on the midterm exam, please just make sure to rip it up for me. No, rip it up. I apologize, Audrey. Trying to say the word rip. So shred it into little pieces. You can pull out a piece of scissors or pair of scissors if you need to or anything. It's not going to have an indicator on your end. It's just mainly for me if I go back and watch your video to see that you did rip it up for me. There is not necessarily anything in particular that will remind you to do that. No. I'm not sure what you mean, Kaylin. Is it an X? So are you meaning if Proctorio is mad at you, will you know? Is that what you're asking maybe? Oh, okay. So if it flags your exam for review, it probably won't tell you, but if you do something particularly egregious, it's just going to kick you out. So you will know if you accidentally tried to open a tab, or you will know that you forgot to put your Mac into do not disturb mode, and somebody sent you a text and it pops up on your screen, because Proctorio is going to kick you out. So you'll know. I would say at least 80% of the exams, it doesn't flag for me to review. So you should be just fine. Interesting that Kaylin, it tells you that you had some floating X. Yeah, I don't think that floating X means anything. I'm not sure what that floating X was. I haven't heard that before. I guess the one other thing I'll add to our list here, if you have trouble during the exam, contact Proctorio. Not sure if I worked with any of you during exam number 1, but I can't get you back into your exam. Only Proctorio can get you back into the exam that you're working on. So contact them first. I'm pretty sure I put in that folder a link that says help me Proctorio. It'll take you to their website. Start a live chat right away. They'll get you back into that exam and you can keep working on it. So get in touch with them first. If they can't solve your problem, then get in touch with me. But I will not be living in front of my computer this weekend. I apologize in advance. We probably will be studying all weekend, right? But Dr. Ellis will be chasing the 4-year-old and the 8-month-old. Ah, yes, Audrey reminded me. That's all I got to say. So Audrey reminded me that I owe you all a penguin. Here comes our daily penguin. Any last minute questions before I turn off the recording? is wishing you all the best. You can do it. Yes, best of luck to everyone else. Feel free to reach out via email if you have any questions. Remember that we did a histology review on Wednesday, so if you want to look over tissues again, that recording is posted. I'll get this recording posted as well. Best of luck to you. Lean on your classmates in GroupMe, and good luck with that exam. So have a great weekend. I hope to hear that it went very well for you. And we will meet again next week. So good luck with that exam.